it's a beautiful late summer's evening. This is Grotto Geyser. That is the trail down to Morning Glory. To my right is the trail up to Old Faithful. And straight ahead of us is the subject of today's virtual Yellowstone tour, the path between Grotto Geyser and Old Faithful. As you can see, Grotto Geyser is a cone geyser, and the cone is approximately 8 feet high, or about 2.4 meters. It has got its odd shape from sinter, and that white stuff that you see there is sinter, and sinter gets brought up in the water that erupts from a geyser. And Grotto's strange shape comes from sinter accumulating over dead trees as the geyser erupted. Grotto Geyser is not one of the 5 geysers in the upper geyser basin that has its eruption times predicted, but it does erupt about every 8 hours or so, and the eruptions are approximately 10 feet high, and they last from about 1 hour to 10 hours. And that trail on the right that you see there is the trail that I previously showed you from Morning Glory up to Old Faithful, which is the main trail. There it is again, through the upper geyser basin. I was telling you about Grotto Geyser's eruptions. They can last, in fact, for over a day. So there's a decent chance that you'll see some water erupting from Grotto Geyser if you do make it down that far in the upper geyser basin. Now that is Giant Geyser ahead of me on the right and Bijou Geyser on the left. Giant Geyser is incredibly powerful, as you can see from its shape. It actually blew itself up, it blew itself apart during a series of eruptions. Giant, however, goes for really long periods of time between eruptions. There were 2 eruptions in 2010. It erupted again in 2015, and the most recent Giant Geyser eruption was in 2019. And it hasn't erupted since, certainly at the time of making this video, which is in 2020. When Giant does erupt, as you might imagine, I've never seen it myself, but it's a very impressive geyser according to National Park Service resources. It can erupt for about an hour and reach heights of about 250 feet or so, which is about 76 meters or so. And during its eruptions, the other geysers in the Giant Geyser group, the smaller ones, can also erupt. And when I talk about a geyser group, that is a number of geysers that are in the same location, named after the main geyser in that location. So with the case of Giant, you'll have Bijou, which I've mentioned to you before, you'll have Mastiff Geyser, and you'll have Turtle Geyser. It's not unusual for geysers to be interconnected, and if I have a chance, I will talk about this a little later. It's very unusual, as I've said before, for Giant Geyser to erupt, but if and when it does erupt, it generally occurs in what's called the hot period, immediately following the start of a Grotto Geyser eruption, as those two are also connected. That's the Firehole River, and I'm going to be going over that bridge across the Firehole River in a moment. I mentioned that Grotto Geyser is not one of the geysers in Yellowstone which have its eruption times predicted. There are 6 geysers in Yellowstone which are predicted regularly. 5 of them are in the upper geyser basin, and those 5 are Grand Geyser, which we will get up close and personal with on this virtual Yellowstone tour. Castle Geyser, which we should catch a glimpse of. Old Faithful, where this virtual Yellowstone tour ends. as well as Riverside Geyser and Daisy Geyser, which is basically somewhere off to our right, off the main trail between Old Faithful and Morning Glory. You'll notice all the sinter around, and sinter is a dead giveaway for an area being a thermal area. If you have a look at where you can see those snags, and a snag is a standing dead tree, those snags off in the distance, that is where Grand Geyser is, as well as the Grand Group of Geysers. And coming up immediately ahead of me, that is called Chromatic Pool. And Chromatic Pool, as you can see, is a really spectacular little hot spring. And just after it, we're going to come to another pool called Beauty Pool. And I mentioned that some of these thermal features are connected underground, and Beauty Pool and Chromatic Pool are two hot springs that are connected. When the water level in one of those two pools goes down, the water level in the other pool goes up. So just say that the water level in Beauty Pool starts increasing, there'll be a concomitant decrease in the water level in Chromatic Pool. And what I'm zooming in on there is either vent or turban geyser erupting, or perhaps even both of them. And I'll talk more about that as we get closer towards Grand Geyser. This is Beauty Pool, and the name that you saw on the sign is a dead giveaway. Just look how deserted this area is. When I did the virtual Yellowstone tour about half an hour ago of this route in the other direction, in other words, from Old Faithful towards Grotto, Grand Geyser had just erupted, so there were a lot more people around. But now that the eruption is long gone, there's not exactly anyone to be seen. The other trail that I mentioned to you, the alternative way that you can go between Morning Glory and Old Faithful, you'll see a lot more people on that trail. A lot more people tend to take that path instead of the one that I'm on at the moment. But this really is a delightful part of Yellowstone, and there are so many little thermal features here. There's so many hot springs and other pools to be seen. Unfortunately, as we saw a moment ago, several of them are actually dying. Now, how do we know that? Because we look at the color of the hot spring, the color of the pool. Like, take a look at that one over there. We'll see that the colors are browns and rusts and those sorts of colors. Very similarly to Morning Glory, which is a very colorful pool. That's generally a sign that the hot spring is unfortunately dying, because what's happening is that the underground source of water, like that hot spring, was really beautifully clear and gray and blue. And when a hot spring is really hot, there's very few organisms that are able to survive in there. There's very few what's called thermophiles, heat-loving organisms. This over here is where Grand Geyser is, and it erupted on my way down. Unfortunately, in between the time I showed you vent and turban erupting and the couple of minutes it took me to, or the couple of minutes it's taken me to get here, vent and turban have stopped erupting. But what happens with Grand Geyser is Grand, as I've pointed out to you before, and look at those bacteria mats, and I hope to talk more about them shortly, but Grand Geyser, Vent Geyser, and Turban Geyser are all connected much the same way that Grotto Geyser and Grotto Geyser and Giant Geyser and some of the others in the area are all connected as well. So when Grand erupts, and please take a look at some of our other virtual Yellowstone tours about Grand Geyser erupting. There are some spectacular eruptions, and you can see them in our YouTube channel or at virtualyellowstonetours.com. That's virtualyellowstonetours.com. You will see Grand Geyser erupting, and at the same time you'll see Vent and Turban Geyser erupting as well. And once Grand Geyser has stopped erupting, and I hope to get back to that in a minute. Look at that little cool geyser going off behind Belgian Pool. That straight ahead of me used to be called Oyster Pool, but after a tourist from Belgium unfortunately fell in it and died, its name was changed to Belgian Pool. I was talking about Grand and Turban and Vent. So you'll have Grand Geyser erupting, and it goes off, and then it'll stop for a while, but don't leave after it stops, because there is almost always an encore performance, sometimes 3 or 4 of them. And the second eruption is always more spectacular than the first one. Grand Geyser generally erupts for about 10 to 12 minutes at a time. Now that over there is Spasmodic Geyser, which is one of my favorite geysers anywhere. You'll see that it has 2 pools, or what they call 2 craters, and it erupts from each of those craters, and the eruptions can be up to about 15 feet high or so. But apart from that, though, there's approximately 20 vents in Spasmodic Geyser, and there can be eruptions from there as well. The eruptions are somewhat irregular, but generally in about the 1 to 3 hour range or so. This is Tardy Geyser coming up on my right, and I know from past experience that there's not an awful lot right next to the trail until we get to Liberty Pool. Off in the distance there, as I zoom in, that is Castle Geyser, which is, you will recall, one of the 5 geysers in Yellowstone in the Upper Geyser Basin, which have their eruption times predicted. The other ones are Old Faithful, Daisy, Riverside, and Grand Geyser, which we have just gone past a few minutes ago. Castle Geyser has about a 10 to 12 hour eruption cycle, and its eruption times are generally predicted to within about 45 minutes either side. It erupts, and this is Liberty Pool coming up on the right now. Castle erupts for about 20 minutes, getting up to about 90 feet, perhaps 27, 28 meters or so. And as I say, that lasts for about 20 minutes, and then it changes into what's called a steam phase, which goes on for about another half an hour or so. This boardwalk now is going to take us towards a part of the Upper Geyser Basin, where we'll see a lot more geysers, and there's also several loops that you can take, as I'll explain to you. I talked before about the health of hot springs and pools, and that one that I just showed you clearly was one where there's not an awful lot of hot water coming up to the surface, but I will get back to that. This would be as good a time as any to take a look at a map of the park and take a look at a map of the area, so we can see exactly where we are relative to the rest of Yellowstone and relative to the rest of the Upper Geyser Basin. Please take a look at the following one of our sites, and that is Old Faithful Inn. There was the gas station and convenience store. Please take a look at the following one of our sites, yellowstonetours.net/map. That's yellowstonetours.net/map. and I'm going to drop in a couple of maps right over here. If you take a look at the map, you'll see that in the southwest corner, or the bottom left of the lower loop, is where the upper geyser basin is, and this close-up map shows us that we're traveling from the top left of the map to the bottom right. In other words, from Grotto Geyser to Old Faithful. There are a number of different trails that can be taken in this part of Yellowstone, and I'll point them out more closely to you when we advance just a little bit further up this boardwalk. But there's the one that we're on, and then you can take a trail that's really a cool trail and a most unique view of Old Faithful. You leave Old Faithful Lodge, cross over the Firehole River, turn right, and that'll take you up to an observation point of Old Faithful, and then you can continue on in a gigantic loop and make your way to what's called Solitary Geyser, so called because it's a geyser sitting all on its own, and then continue back down again. And one of the amazing things of that trail is that in just a couple of minutes you can be away from the hustle and bustle of Old Faithful and all of the crowds of the upper geyser basin, and be completely by yourself in the forest, away from everything. And as I say, you're just a couple of minutes away from Old Faithful itself. So that's the larger loop, and then just underneath it there's a smaller loop that you can do, where you basically stay on the boardwalks on the same side of the Firehole River that we're on at the moment, and you get to see a number of really awesome geysers. There's the trail that we're on, as I mentioned, and then also on the other side of the Firehole River, there's another trail that you can take, this one a much shorter one, to Blue Star Spring, and then down to an overlook right on the Firehole River of some bacteria mats, and finishing up in the parking lot at Old Faithful. And as we get up towards a more highly trafficked portion of the upper geyser basin, just on the right there, coming in and out of view, you've got the Lion Group of geysers, and we'll be closer to that in a moment. Then up there is where the trail from Solitary Geyser comes down and meets up with that loop that I mentioned to you. So there's just so much that you can see and do, and so many people when they're at the upper geyser basin can find themselves, and I will get back to that. Now there is the trail that comes down from Solitary Geyser. So once you've done that big loop from the Old Faithful observation point and all the way to Solitary Geyser, that's where you would come down. That over there is that was North Goddle Spring, followed by Goddle's Geyser, and now we're at the Lion Group of geysers. And I've mentioned to you before that a group is named after the main feature, the main thermal element, if you like, in an area. So you've got the Daisy Group of geysers, and that over there is Hot Spring. And off in the background, that looks like Beehive Geyser erupting. Now, Beehive is really a wonderful geyser. It's a cone geyser, and I'm so glad that I caught it. It's a cone geyser, as you can see, so you can see the direction of the geyser, obviously going straight up. It's not one of the geysers in the upper geyser basin, which eruption times are predicted. So you have to be fairly lucky to see Beehive erupt, and that's what I was. As you can see, I was just walking along on my way back to Old Faithful when I came across it erupting. And you'll notice that there's not a large crowd there, because no one obviously knew that Beehive was going to be going off. And those of us who just happened to be in the area were really fortunate. Look at that rainbow a little to the left of Beehive. We've got a separate video in our YouTube channel which just focuses on this Beehive Geyser eruption. So I'm not going to show you all of it. If you can have a look to the left of Beehive though, you can see what's called the Beehive indicator geyser. It gives you an indicator of when Beehive is going to erupt. But just remember, if you go to our YouTube channel or to our site virtualyellowstonetours.com, that's virtualyellowstonetours.com, you can see the entirety of this Beehive eruption. Beehive has now finished its eruption and it's entered what's called the steam phase. This is something that almost all geysers do. Once the water has come out, what's left is really hot steam and often really noisy steam, much like a steam vent. And what you can see here is how wet the boardwalk got, and the people who were standing there got absolutely drenched. If you don't know the way that Beehive operates, it's so close to that boardwalk, and if the wind is lined up correctly, you can get pretty darn wet and pretty soaked while you're standing watching Beehive erupt. Coming up on the left is Plume Geyser, which erupts about every 20 minutes or so. It's is not one of Yellowstone's major geysers, and it certainly doesn't get up anywhere near as high as Beehive does. But what's really fascinating is that in this area there are just so many different geysers. That erupting, and it erupts often, is Anemone Geyser, and Anemone Geyser is actually two separate geysers, Big Anemone and Little Anemone Geyser. But what I was saying is that Yellowstone has approximately half of the world's active geysers. And the Upper Geyser Basin, which is where I am at the moment, is an area of about 1 square mile. And in this area of 1 square mile, there are about 150 different geysers, which means that this part of Yellowstone is the part where there is the greatest concentration of geysers anywhere in the world. Now, there are other geyser basins in this part of Yellowstone. You've got the Lower Geyser Basin, the Midway Geyser Basin, you've got Black Sand Basin, Biscuit Basin, but really this is the granddaddy of them all. Coming up on our left is Sulphide Springs, and we can see that up ahead of me the trail splits. To the right is To Old Faithful, and then over there to the left, that is the trail that will bring you back down from Solitary Geyser, and you can also use it as part of the lower of those two loops that I previously mentioned to you. You may recall there's that one loop, the larger one, that goes up the hill that's off there to my left, and that'll take you up to the observation point, to the overlook of Old Faithful from up high, and then on to Solitary Geyser, and then back down again, and then underneath it you have the smaller loop, and over here is the trail that you would take up to the observation point. And that is the one where I mentioned to you in just minutes you can be away from the crowds of Old Faithful. That's the Firehole River. You can be away from the crowds of Old Faithful and all by yourself in the forest. The Firehole River, as I've mentioned many times in these virtual Yellowstone tours, is mainly a thermal river. And what I mean by it being a thermal river is that much of the water that's in the Firehole River comes from thermal features, in other words, from hot springs and geysers, predominantly geysers erupting, and the overflow of water from hot springs flowing into the river. I mean, consider the Firehole River as it goes past the Midway Geyser Basin. You've got Excelsior Geyser Crater putting almost 4,000 gallons of water a minute into the Firehole River, and that is just from one thermal feature. Well, we are approaching the All Faithful area itself. You can see All Faithful Lodge coming into view there at the background of this shot, and in a moment you'll be able to see just where All Faithful itself is. And we're just about getting to the end of this virtual Yellowstone tour. Thank you so much for joining me on another one of our virtual Yellowstone tours. If you enjoy this virtual Yellowstone tour series, please consider giving us a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel, and that's All Faithful over there. And remember that you can see all of our virtual Yellowstone tours at virtualyellowstonetours.com. Thank you.